So, guys, as we've mentioned a couple of times, we're expecting some big Supreme Court rulings, in particular on what has always been a contentious issue of affirmative action being used in college admissions. So we thought we would set up a little panel so we could debate the topic on the merits, not necessarily the legal rationale, but the actual merits of the policy. So very happy to be joined this morning by Michael Starr Hopkins. He is an op-ed writer for the Daily Beast and longtime friend of the show. And also Delano Squires. He is a research fellow for Heritage Foundation and new friend of the show. Great to have you, Delano.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just start by making the case. Michael, I'll start with you. What do you think is the case in favor of the policy of affirmative action?
Across this country, we've had systemic racism. And so when you look at things like redlining, income inequality, I mean, you can look at DC as a perfect example. When you cross into Anacostia, the schools are failing. But when you go to Chevy Chase, Maryland, 10 miles away, they have marble floors. They've got teachers with master's degrees. Those things matter because at the end of the day, income inequality shows up in very different ways. So Black Americans, our income is $45,000 for the average median African American. But for white Americans, it's $75,000. And when you start to have those kind of disparities, it affects you all the way up. And so I think in terms of affirmative action, what they're really looking at is trying to level the playing field. It's not perfect, but I think it's been something that's been important, not just for African Americans and Hispanics, but for white Americans as well, because it teaches the differences in what's going on in society. Black Americans can give perspective, and white Americans can learn from those perspectives.
And we'll get to the polling on this in a little bit, but what we've actually seen, interestingly enough, Michael, you have a chance to respond to this, Delano, is that in terms of leveling the playing field, this has changed the levels of the playing field, particularly for Asian Americans. So white Americans, one demographic I think that has probably been hurt in some cases, but very obviously, especially when you're looking at the Ivies or California public schools, Asian Americans have really been feeling the brunt of this as it's an effort to sort of level the playing field. How much do you think that sort of conspicuously over the last couple of decades in particular has exhibited or made the case that I'm sure you've probably been on board with for a while against affirmative action?
So my views on affirmative action have sort of morphed over time.
Fluctuated.
I think part of it is, one, I'm big on defining terms. And I think a lot of people confuse affirmative action with racial preferences, with diversity sort of writ large. I understand, Michael's point, but the honest, if we're being honest about it, Harvard, the black students that are going to Harvard are not coming from east of the river in Anacostia, generally speaking, or West Baltimore or East Flatbush, Brooklyn. We're not talking about the lowest income students. It's typically, middle class, black students who are, going to Ivy Leagues and other selective universities. And to your point, I do think because of the complexity of race and its evolving nature over decades, what ends up happening is that Asian students feel like they are paying for what the society says white people did to black people some number of years ago. And I think ultimately you can't have equality in any sense when you are subjecting different people to different standards of assessment based on skin color, ethnicity, or any other immutable characteristic. And that's what's actually happening at Harvard. So a few data points. Harvard has, the applicants ranked in deciles. So, first to 10th being the highest, number one being the lowest. A black student in the 4th decile has a higher chance of being admitted into Harvard than an Asian student in the 10th decile. Now, mind you, if you're in the 4th decile at Harvard, you're not some schlub. You'd probably be in the 8th decile at the University of Massachusetts. But that student is being given an artificial bump over a student who has a more competitive academic background because of this notion that this is going to, I guess, redress some of the issues that have gone on with race in our country's past. And I don't think that's sustainable. And I think the biggest reason why, and I think Michael knows this and would acknowledge this, is that racial preferences are unsustainable because it's something that its proponents demand but will never claim. Because we'll say, oh, we need racial preferences to keep the Ivy Leagues diverse. But then any particular black student who's there say, oh, you only got in because of racial preferences. They say, oh, no, that's not true. I earned my way here. So those two things are irreconcilable. And none of us want to feel as if we're being tokenized.
So I hear a few arguments there, Michael, to get you to respond to. So number one is that the policy is discriminatory towards Asian Americans. I do think that there's some evidence that backs that up. Number two is that, okay, if your goal is to uplift poor black folks, this policy really benefits more middle class to upper middle class black folks. And number three, that if you are a Black American, this is something that Justice Thomas, for example, has spoken to. If you are a Black American who is who is perceived as having benefited from affirmative action, then you're always going to be sort of taken down a notch, that you're always going to be viewed as lesser than because you are even perceived to have benefited from this policy.
Let me address the lesser than. Affirmative action isn't gonna cure that. Whether you're at Harvard or elsewhere, there's insidious bias in this country, and I think affirmative action is never gonna redress that. But what it can do, and I actually disagree with the idea that Black people aren't going to Harvard from poor schools, because when you look at the numbers, most African Americans who are going to elite universities are first generation college students, and so I think the idea that somehow it's going to make African Americans feel like they didn't get there on their own or they didn't deserve to be there, I think that's, no offense, intellectually lazy, because at the end of the day, African Americans are starting on first base, and you're seeing a lot of white Americans just based on things like redlining, neighborhoods, funding, starting on second or third base.
And then what about the point on Asian Americans? Because to me, that's been one of the more compelling points, is that this is the group that has really, quote unquote, suffered from affirmative action. You see, in systems that do have affirmative action, the percentage of Asian Americans has been diminished. You've seen efforts even at elite high schools here in Northern Virginia to try to deal with the fact that they feel like, oh my God, we got too many Asian students. Yeah. You've seen some horrific things that, are just, in my opinion, overtly racist, where they'll take an Asian candidate who has really high grades, really high SAT scores, but they'll mark them down in these really squishy sort of racial tropes of personality to try to make the school a little bit less Asian. So what do you think of that critique of the policy?
Well, I'd say Bakke, the case from, I think, 30, 40 years ago, made it illegal to have race be the deciding factor, or the deciding decision. It's a factor, but it's not the deciding reason that someone's accepted.
Right.
They still have to be qualified. They still have to be meeting the threshold to be accepted. But once again, I think it's the idea that if you're starting here and the other person is starting here, then we've got to balance that out. And so Asian Americans aren't underrepresented at universities. When you actually look at the numbers, they're represented equal to population. But when you look at the numbers for African Americans, it's overwhelmingly underrepresented. And in states that have gotten rid of affirmative action, it's almost 20% drops in diversity. And so, whether it's in schools or the workplace, Gap had the issue where they had the monkey shirt. If they had Black people in senior positions, things like that wouldn't happen. I had roommates in college who had never been around African Americans. And so they had certain beliefs just based on things they had seen on TV and culture. And so having the opportunity to be able to give them that experience made them better.
Delano, let me push you a little bit. First of all, do you think that diversity is a goal that we should even be, that you think is valuable, that's important for society? This is a goal that you generally support.
Yeah, I think diversity is a good thing, generally speaking, right? But I like ideological diversity, I like ethnic diversity, I like regional diversity.
Class
diversity. But that's typically not what you get on a lot of college campuses. You have people who think the same but look different. And to me, that's not particularly diverse.
So you had Michael acknowledge, listen, the policy is not perfect. Almost no policy is exactly perfect. But it has increased. And you can see this in California, where they rolled back affirmative action in the UC system, back in the 90s, I think. You have seen the percentage of African Americans decline. You have seen a decrease in diversity, even though they're trying to sort of work around the fact that they can't overtly do affirmative action anymore. You've seen a decline in diversity. So what do you say to the case that, listen, you might say the policy is not perfect, but at least it's something. At least it is allowing more Black folks to ascend to achieve that middle class dream, upper middle class dream, and make it into elite society in America?
So I think a couple of things. One, I think what you've seen in California is that there may be a decrease in number of students, let's say, going to Berkeley, but some of the students who may have been getting an artificial bump to go into Berkeley may be at UC Davis, right? So it's not that fewer students are going, I think it's just a better match between academic profile and institution.
But how better?
I just saw some research, though, that did show that, because I've heard this argument before, too, that it's actually better for them that they're not ending up at Berkeley because they're going to be better able to handle the workload at UC Davis, et cetera.
Right.
There is research, though, that shows that that's not really accurate, that they will still suffer, an income drop from not being in Berkeley and being in UC Davis or one of the other Fresno or whatever the other state schools are. So there is backing to the idea that, it is not actually beneficial for them to be in a lower college system, that they would have been better off if they were at Berkeley.
So a couple of things. One,
Yeah.
I'm not a subscriber to the sort of Ivy League or bust mentality, right? The other thing is, it's better to actually get a degree than to start at a more prestigious school and not finish. And I think it's interesting that so many of the universities point to the diversity of the freshman class. They rarely say, this is the diversity of the graduating class. And I can tell you exactly how it's better. If the average Harvard student comes in with a 1450 SAT, and I have a 1360 SAT, which is still above the national average. It's a very good SAT score, and higher than what I actually scored, by the way. And I'm in computational physics, and that's being taught at a 1440 speed. I'm at a 1360 speed. I'm going to be behind my classmates. And what some of the research has shown, particularly at, I want to say this is Duke, Black students are more likely to come in majoring in STEM fields, but also more likely to switch out to liberal arts and sociology and other fields. And part of that, I do think, is because of the mismatch. So it's not just, let's just get everybody in. It's how are the students faring while they're there? And I will say this, and Justice Thomas said this in the Grutter case, and he actually is my favorite justice.
You lose me when you quote Thomas.
We're
going to agree to disagree on that one.
We're on the Clarence Thomas team, and you guys are on the bad team.
But one of the things that
the Harvard grad.
One of the things that he noted is that these policies benefit the universities most because they get to say we're maintaining our elite, selective status, and look how diverse we are. But again, they're concerned about the freshman class and what these universities do, because I do think it attaches a stigma, because no one wants to be referred to as a diversity hire or an affirmative action candidate. And that's why I said it's a benefit people want, but they won't claim. If Michael served in the military and he went to Harvard on the GI Bill, he said, yeah, I got the GI. If I had a disability and I said, yes, I'm benefiting from, a disability program, sure, no problem. But the minute you suggest a student at a selected university, a Black student, is there because of affirmative action, people bristle. So I think we need to be honest intellectually about the effects that this policy has had. And last thing I'll say is this. It's interesting to me that when the left wants to criticize Justice Thomas, one of the first things that they do is say he's an affirmative action candidate.
Well,
he only got the job because he's Black.
I've never said that.
But I will. So before we get to the polling, I do want to toss to Michael a pretty important question. I think in all of this debate. Sandra Day O'Connor, I think, came around in her decision basically saying that it's a temporary measure and a stopgap measure. And I think it's predicated on that idea that it's trying to solve a problem. Like affirmative action wants to put itself out of business and eventually, to your point, level the playing field. So at what threshold? And if there is a threshold, why are we not there yet? And that's hypothetical, or not hypothetical, but that's not a rhetorical question. That's actually sincere. What is the threshold at which affirmative action would no longer be necessary?
When schools in Anacostia are as good as schools in Chevy Chase or in Northern Virginia, that I think is a threshold. When earning opportunities are the same, whether Black or white, I think that's a threshold. But right now, your zip code determines your future. Where you grow up determines how much money you're gonna make, what your lifestyle is gonna be like, and I think that in and of itself is the problem. So when you talk about basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it's problematic. Like, we're gonna be called affirmative action hires, affirmative action, admittance, whether we're there or not. Like,
there are heavily white schools in Appalachia that are nowhere near Chevy Chase and are probably much more similar to Anacostia. So I guess why is race still the best proxy when it's a class conversation?
Because there's a historical factor to this.
Agree.
And when I get pulled over, they don't see me as lawyer Michael Hopkins. They see me as a threat. And I think you've got to look at the historical aspects to all of this.
Michael, let me ask you, this is kind of a critique from the left, which is, the policies that throughout American history have been most effective at actually reducing the racial wealth gap and reducing the racial wage gap have been universal policies. They've been lifting the minimum wage and making it apply to everyone, not having these carve-outs for professions that are historically disproportionately African American. Things like the child tax credit.
Absolutely.
That programs that are universal are, number one, more politically popular than affirmative action, which I think we could all agree. We can go ahead and throw the polling up on the screen, which just depends on how you ask the words, the language, or whatever. But it is a divisive issue. I think everybody can acknowledge that. So why not focus the political capital on something like increasing union density or lifting the minimum wage or achieving universal health care, which may actually be more effective at the goals that you and I both share?
Honestly, because Republicans won't agree to it. Like, we live in a democracy.
But Republicans aren't agreeing to this either.
Well, yeah, but this was built in. When LBJ put this system in, he said it's not enough to open the doors, but we've got to level the playing field so that people can walk through those doors. You know, I would wonder, do you have a problem with legacy admission? Because that's affirmative action for white people. Like,
Not necessarily. It's not.
how
It's not explicitly.
George W. Bush would not have gotten in Yale, but for the fact that his father was Herbert Walker Bush and his grandfather was Prescott Bush. So do we really think he earned the right?
standard for Malia Obama?
So you can use one example. No.
I'm just asking you.
That's
a third generation Harvard.
That is a red herring. So you take the first black president, and use his daughter as the one example of how affirmative action works.
I'm an equal weights and measures guy, right? So if it's like when the left talks about class and billionaires, right? Eat the rich. They love to talk about Bill Gates, but Oprah Winfrey's a billionaire. Is she included? So if you say you're against legacies,
how many black billionaires are there?
I have no idea.
Exactly.
But again,
there's not very many.
That's irrelevant to the point at hand. I like to focus. Racial preferences at selective universities don't have to do with how the police see you or all these other issues, because at the end of the day, that does not correct the issues in K through 12 education. And one of the things that the left does not
a result
speak
of
about,
redlining.
We can get that's a different segment. One of the things that the left does not speak about as it relates to education is family, home environment, the ethnic breakdown, Asian, white, Hispanic, black, that you see in admittance rate to Harvard tracks SAT scores. It tracks the number of hours that students spend on homework, both the number of hours and the percentage of students that spend 5 days a week doing homework. But then what the left says is, no, we have to correct these issues at Harvard and Duke and North Carolina.
But Delano, I don't think that's actually fair, as someone who has had some critiques of the affirmative action policy, because the left does talk about things like child tax credit, things like paid sick leave, things like paid family leave, which may not be the way that you talk about families.
Correct.
But is certainly a policy that helps support families, helps enable people to have families, helps enable people to have healthy families and maintain a marriage, which could be under a lot of financial stress. So I don't think it's fair to say that this is the only policy that they focus on, when there are a broad range of policies that have been discussed and some of them implemented even under the Biden administration that are targeted directly at families.
I think it's interesting that you say that. Let's go back to a Harvard alum. President Barack Obama, to his credit, and I will give him credit for this, is the last president I can think of, particularly the last Democrat, national Democrat, who regularly spoke about the importance of marriage, fatherhood, and family as it related to social outcomes. In 2016 and 2020, the Democratic National Party took those references out of their party platform. And now, if you want to talk about family, it's child tax credit, it's maternal health care. And I'm not against any of those things. I'm not against, paid family leave, but that's a different conversation than saying, the ideal situation for every child in this country is to be raised by two married biological parents in a low-conflict, loving home.
Hold on. The job of the federal government, though, is to set the policy landscape, right? It's not to get into people's lives and tell them you should be married or you shouldn't be married. You can, by having a policy of, for example, the child tax credit or lifting wages so people can afford to support a family. That's the job of the federal government. So that's why it makes sense that is the conversation that is happening at that level. And by the way, I do find it, you're talking about what the left does, et cetera, I find it very selective that the right loves to claim they care about families and might even say, like, oh, in theory, I support child tax credit. But when brass tacks came, I didn't see any Republicans supporting the extension of a child tax credit.
And I'll just very quickly, because I think you're going to say something similar. As the welfare state has expanded, so has fatherlessness among not just black kids, but kids in general.
When has the welfare state been expanding? I mean,
Since
Bill Clinton ended welfare as we know it. So the idea that the welfare state is expanding, I think, is belied by the evidence.
It's a pretty stark contrast pre-LBJ and post-LBJ. And the trajectory of the black family has been one direction since then. And we may disagree about correlation there, but it is clear that since America created a bigger welfare state, fatherlessness has expanded.
But like you have to look at crime for that. I mean, when you look at the fact that you've put black people in neighborhoods because of redlining, because of historical inadequacies, put them in neighborhoods where they have failing schools, lack of job opportunities. Anacostia doesn't even have grocery stores until like 5 years ago. And so you set people up for failure and then basically say, but it's your fault.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit because there's.
I want to respond to the
Go ahead,
point
respond to the point.
I agree. The job of the federal government is to set policy, right?
Yeah.
But politicians, including the president, they have a purse, they have a pen, and they have a pulpit. And politicians have no problem using their bully pulpit to say, you should think this. The last, particularly 3 years.
Do you really think that if Joe Biden got up there and said, you should stay married, or you should, like, there's so many other factors that go into that. I don't think that would, like, solve the problem.
Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
I take the position that in city after city across this country, if every sign that said Black Lives Matter said marriage before carriage, and every politician was as resolute in talking about the importance of the natural family as they are about telling white folks how they should feel about black people, I do think that would make a difference.
Have you met Donald Trump? Like,
so
you can't talk about family in the left.
Trump is not my standard, but continue.
I mean, you talked about, specific people. Donald Trump isn't about the family. I mean, he's had multiple marriages,
I mean, listen,
divorces, prostitutes.
Joe Biden's family is under, attack right now, some of it justified, but he certainly talks about his family and, uses that as a model of, clearly fatherhood and his family is important to him. But I think we just have a very philosophical difference here, which is that you put it more on the individual, and I put it more on the systems and the structures that are in place that make it very difficult for people to be able to afford a family, stay married, get a house, get that, middle class sort of bourgeois stability that is the core of the American dream. So we'll put that philosophical, ideological difference to the side because one piece that I'm very curious about is, I mentioned before, California affirmative action has been dead for a while in terms of the UC system. And they've used some proxy workarounds that are basically like looking at class instead of looking at race. In Texas, they have a program where the top 10% of high school grads at all, high schools within Texas, that they are admitted to the UT system. And that has also had an impact of, it's basically a workaround because you have, schools that are really disparate and unequal, as I think Michael is aptly pointing out here. And so that also allows a disproportionate number, I shouldn't say disproportionate, but more equivalent number of Black and brown students to end up in the college system. So do you support those sorts of workarounds that are basically trying to achieve the same result, but not allowed to go at it quite so directly? Yeah. And also, we should just say, did this just come down?
We actually just got the as ruling. We're talking.
Wow.
The Supreme Court ruled the Harvard and UNC race-based, I'm reading from a tweet here, the affirmative action on a race basis, unconstitutional, 6-3. John Roberts has wrote the majority opinion.
So probably a partisan down the line decision there, which is what was expected. But so then this is actually appropriate because the next fight will be, are those workarounds that are trying to get at the same result, but using proxies like class or geography or whatever, are those acceptable to you, or do you think that those need to be got rid of as well?
Texas's, top 10%.
Top 10%.
Because again, the issue to me is not diversity as a concept. It's the use of race to impose a higher standard on some groups of people and to judge other groups of people by a lower standard. And all of us know, if we were talking about this in 2043, and Black and Hispanic students were the ones who were knocking it out of the park, who had the highest SAT scores in the country, who spent the most amount of time doing homework and all those other things, and their numbers were basically capped at selective universities, we would have a problem with it.
Yeah, because quotas are illegal.
But it's not just a quota, because the Asian students will say, look, we've been at 23% admittance to Harvard for the last however many years, even though we constitute by far the largest number of students with the top sort of academic dossiers that apply to the school. So my point is, if we were talking about the same thing with Black students, where if you look at those top 2 deciles, you're talking about a significantly larger percentage of students in those deciles than students from other groups, we would have a problem with it. And I can see Ben Crump writing the tweet right now. Right? You don't mind when we dribble the ball and dance for you, but when it comes to breaking into elite universities, now you want to cap our numbers. So I'm just holding to the same principle.
If we ever get to the day where that happens, then yeah, let's redress this. But at this moment, that's not what's going on. And I think the idea that Harvard and Yale are the only schools where affirmative action helps students is false. I mean, all over the country, affirmative action helps students get into, University of Michigan, UVA, state schools.
Selective schools. As the school becomes less selective, the use of racial preferences tends to decrease. So.
Michael, similar question to you, which is, as I said, it's not like in places where affirmative action has gone away, like they've just completely gotten rid of considering any of these characteristics, and class has been a key workaround. I mean, how do you feel about that as a workaround? Because on the one hand, it does acknowledge that, listen, people in West Virginia, they weren't enslaved. I don't want to put it on the same level. They have been screwed over by company towns and all that stuff, and historically disadvantaged in their own special ways as well. So is class a better proxy at this point? Do you see it as a huge loss in terms of the goals that you're trying to achieve?
I think income and class should absolutely be another factor that's considered. I have no problem with that. Using Appalachia as an example, the way they've been wrecked by the Sacklers, the way that the coal industry has absolutely just destroyed towns and families, that's absolutely something we should consider. And just like considering race, I think considering how people economically have lived is something that it helps all of us. But the idea that we should just, carte blanche get rid of, race and history as factors, I think it belies a failure for us.
So I could give a perfect example of good diversity and bad diversity. And for the bad diversity, I won't even talk about race.
Yeah, where's bad diversity?
Here's good diversity, right? And this one does deal with race. I think of the Tuskegee Airmen, right, who were barred from being combat pilots for a period of time until Congress said we want to make this available to every, to African Americans, so on and so forth. Those men went through the same, if not higher standards than their white counterparts. So when you say, well, if you're black, you're going to be looked on as less than, I actually think that's not the case. Because no one puts an asterisk next to anything that the Tuskegee Airmen did. And actually, when the Air Force did their first Top Gun competition, it was a Tuskegee Airman who won the first one. So to me, that's wider net diversity.
But tell the whole story. When they came home, they then had to sit in the back of the bus.
Correct. But that's not the point. No.
You got to tell the whole story.
I'm making a point about diversity specifically, not redlining on any of this other stuff, right? And I don't even dispute your history. I'm just saying that's not the point. Here's bad diversity, because we all know this doesn't just stop at race. It's all different types of characteristics. When the Biden administration celebrates the appointment of Sam Brinton, right? They said, it's not just, he deals with nuclear rods and all this other stuff. It's, we're so happy. He is a non-binary, so on individual. Okay, what does that have to do with his qualifications?
Representation matters.
Right? And it does. I'm not saying representation does not matter. I'm just saying skill and merit matter more. So I prefer the type of diversity, right, that finds people who fly planes, not the type of diversity that gets people who steal from the airport. Right, and that's why he's no longer in the administration, because they were looking for the wrong thing. They put their emphasis on the wrong syllable. It wasn't about Sam Brinton's qualifications. It was about his identity, and to me, that is the lower bar type of diversity. And I'm for wider net, not lower bar.
Well, history was made while we were talking to you guys and while we were actually having this debate, and so I will read a pretty big quote here from Chief Justice John Roberts in his conclusion in the decision. He says, a benefit to a student who overcame racial discrimination, for example, must be tied to that student's courage and determination, or a benefit to a student whose heritage or culture motivated him or her to assume a leadership role or attain a particular goal must be tied to that student's unique ability to contribute to the university. In other words, the student must be treated based on his or her experiences and an individual individual, not on the basis of race. Many universities have for too long done just the opposite, and in doing so, they have concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. So that's where Chief Justice John Roberts came down.
Yeah, Michael, I'll give you the last word since we'll let you respond to Chief Justice John Roberts here. And then super grateful, though, for this debate from both of you and the contributions that you both made. Thank you. Go ahead, respond to
I would just say John Roberts
there.
is the same person who said that since we had a black president, that race should no longer be considered in terms of like voting protections and things like that when he stripped away the voting rights. We obviously know that's not true because we've watched Republicans attack the right to vote for African Americans all over the country. We have a history. I think we've got to tell the whole story about that history and not just try to cherry pick things. And when you do the holistic approach, I think that's when you actually achieve the goals that we want.
This is one of the best debates that I can remember.
Really enjoyed hearing both of your perspectives.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.